Hi, I'm Lee Harris, and I'm the solo developer of Fragile Existence, which is a space-based RTS with something of a survival twist. Plus it has aspects of what makes 4X titles so compelling, like empire management and research, and sort of directing your units in this constant kind of risk versus reward kind of fashion. But there's also something a little different going on here too. Set several hundred years in our future, what ultimately makes this game distinct is that you take command of a fleet after Earth and all of her colonies are simultaneously wiped out. Then your job is to ultimately become a Dharma from Battlestar Galactica and to guide the survivors to some distant safe haven, all the while being pursued by an unknown enemy at every turn. And this is a real RTS, like both in space and on the surface of every planet you come across, whilst undertaking this journey, sending out scouts to explore systems, then dropping units and harvesters onto actual spherical worlds, scavenging for supplies and fighting off other scattered remnants of humanity along the way. Early prototyping on Fragile Existence actually began way back in May 2020, just as the first lockdown was being put into effect here in the UK. Before this, I was actually teaching science, believe it or not, and I'd apparently chosen that moment to move on to something new. But suddenly the job opportunities were starting to dry up, and as a bit of a side distraction, I just sort of decided I was going to start to learn to use the Unity game engine. Now, I've used Unreal before, and mostly blueprint type stuff, but Unity looked really interesting, and I was a fairly decent programmer already. If you don't know, Unity is C#. And I sort of basically came up with the idea to try and put together like a little portfolio of little game pieces so that I can mention that on a CV and essentially worm my way into the game dev industry, because you know that sounded like a pretty fun place to be. It turned out that I never really got around to making more than one portfolio piece. The first thing I really worked on was the idea of a spherical environment with a planet at the center and the ships moving around it in circular paths. Not quite orbiting per se, but moving around a planet as if they were adjusting their orbit, whilst still having a specific destination point that they would then hold position above. Now ultimately this is like having a two-dimensional grid that you've wrapped around a sphere, and it lets you move ships in orbit through pretty much traditional RTS click to move type controls, and everything pretty much stays where you expect it to be. Now I did originally try out having ships moving in real orbital paths around planets, but it just gets needlessly complicated and I very quickly lost any interest in going down that route. This is much more homeworld inspired and gamified, if you want to say that, but the spherical environment is important here since the goal is to be able to interact directly with the world below. So we have ships that can be moved around in orbit, but at this point I was modelling planets merely as spheres with high resolution textures of real planets applied, so there really wasn't much potential for any kind of interactivity with the ground surface. This led to a lengthy research phase where I looked into the technical side of planet generation, much akin to that you sort of see in Spore or much more recently in something like planetary annihilation. The common approach is that you kind of stretch out a cube into a sphere, or a so-called quad sphere, and you do this because it means you get more control of how accurately textures can be mapped onto the surface. Many games featuring spherical worlds will then use procedural generation to create height variation across the surface. So you use random noise of some sort to determine where the oceans are, where the mountain peaks on a planet land up. But ultimately I ended up experimenting with something called Voronoi noise, which allows you to create these cell-like regions, and you can have more specific data attached to that. You can label the biome type or the average temperature of each of these cells, and that gives you the ability to simulate more interesting climate or tectonic model, and let the planet generation be built upon that metadata instead of a pure random simulation. Since the plot of Fragile Existence takes place across a number of solar systems and not just a single planet, the logical next step is to be able to produce entire systems with interconnected worlds. Now, there are a few technical hurdles to consider here, since game engines don't really like handling massive game worlds, and you need to use a few tricks here and there to give the impression that distances between things are larger than you perhaps might think they are. Part of the required compromise is to include travel lanes for the fleet to move between planets in the current system, so you can't just send your ships anywhere you like without limit. The intention is that all the action should happen near planets or other points of interest anyway, so I figured this was an acceptable trade-off. Now, another thing that got added at this stage was the homeworld style sensor screen map display, which is switched to as you zoom outwards, and lets you keep track of your assets spread throughout the system. Now, I think it looks kind of cool, and it's it just sort of snaps between the two. It just works. It's elegant. Now, ship movement itself is spline based rather than physics based, so it's essentially deterministic in nature. The calculations for an entire requested move can be found in advance, or whenever the CPU is free to work on that. And then each ship only has to recalculate as its circumstances change. Now, this is all related to thinking about scalability as you add more and more units, especially across an entire solar system. The one thing that truly binds everything together here is the dropship. You anchor your fleet in orbit, then select stored assets to dispatch to a planet's surface, and watch as they get ferried down to the landing zone. When the mission is complete, those same dropships carry your ground units back up to the hangar decks of your capital ships. Early planetary terrain was admittedly pretty basic, and the planet scaling was initially a little too compact, as can be seen from the first reveal trailer footage, which actually featured at Gamescom 21. Warp conduits are also introduced as a way of interacting with the fleet, whilst the next solar system was loaded in the background. Core gameplay components started to filter through from the early prototyping stages, with physicalized inventories and cargo holds for every ship and unit in the fleet, modular components which let you customize and expand your capabilities, and ground-based building and resource gathering starting to be fleshed out. I also partnered up with Texas-based publisher Hooded Horse and released my second trailer on IGN, which featured some of the latest work on ground and orbital combat. Units actually take localized damage, which is visible as parts of the outer hull is stripped away and fires can ignite, which will later need to be controlled. The ground terrain was completely reworked to be based on height brush data, most of which is sculpted in a program called Gaia, and is hooked up to the procedural system to generate hills and mountains which units can traverse directly, and which can block line of sight, giving an edge to those of the higher ground. So, that's the story so far. Much of the last 2 years has been spent working through the technical side, building a universe, and the not so insignificant goal of creating spherical worlds where pretty much everything has to be custom built and optimized every step of the way for this whole thing to work. As the creation toolset approaches maturity, the game itself is starting to take shape on top of this potentially endless galaxy of systems, planets and moons, as your fleet races to stay ahead of a seemingly unstoppable enemy, to stay alive by whatever means possible. Even if we risk losing what's left of our humanity along the way.